It started like any other morning in courtroom 12, sunlight stretching through tall, dust-smeared windows onto the polished oak of the judge's bench. The hum of expectation filled the air, the kind of tense quiet that sets in before anything truly important is about to happen. People weren't just watching the court today. They were waiting for a spectacle, and they got it. Judge Richard Hallstrom had built his reputation on severity. He was known for his brutal efficiency, his intolerance for what he considered grandstanding, and above all, for his sharp tongue. But beneath his well-tailored robe and steely presence, there was something else, a long-standing disdain for anyone who challenged his authority, especially if they did so with passion and intelligence. So when Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett walked into his courtroom, he didn't just see a witness. He saw a threat. Crockett, known for her fierce advocacy and refusal to be silenced, had been subpoenaed to testify in a federal oversight hearing tied to judicial misconduct in the state's southern districts. The public had barely noticed the hearings until her name was attached. Then the cameras showed up, the blogs lit up, and the courtroom that morning became more stage than tribunal. But the real drama hadn't begun yet. What happens when power meets resistance? When someone who has always had the last word faces someone who will not yield? What lines are crossed when ego outweighs justice? Judge Hallstrom interrupted her mid-sentence, leaned forward, and let the courtroom hear what he thought of her testimony. It was not just disrespect. It was mockery. He smirked. "Are we still on topic, Congresswoman? Or are you auditioning for a debate team?" Laughter. Not from the jury nor the attorneys, but from a few members of the gallery who had no place in laughing at all. Crockett didn't flinch, but her expression shifted. The kind of shift you only see when dignity is threatened and control is the only weapon left. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lash out. But something had changed. You could feel it. A quiet fury, honed and controlled, settled in her bones. And those who knew her, truly knew her, understood something in that moment. Jasmine Crockett wasn't going to forget this. Was the judge just being his usual cold, sarcastic self? Or was this something more? A targeted attempt to humiliate a woman who had already made waves by speaking truth to power. It wasn't the first time Hallstrom had crossed a line. But what made this moment different? What pushed this incident from courtroom misconduct into a full-blown scandal? And why, just days later, would a federal marshal be walking him out of that very same courthouse in handcuffs? The courtroom finished that day like it had begun, in silence. But beneath the stillness, the wires were sparking. Journalists scribbled, cameras clicked, and somewhere in the back row, a Department of Justice observer sent a quiet message to her superior. Things were about to get a lot more complicated. Jasmine Crockett left courtroom 12 without a word to the cameras. Her staff knew better than to press her, and the security detail flanked her like walls of stone. But the silence that followed her exit echoed louder than any press statement. That was the moment people began paying attention. Because Crockett, the woman who never shied away from a microphone, said nothing. In the days that followed, the video clip of Judge Hallstrom's mocking interruption flooded social media. No headline could quite capture the tension in her eyes, the poise she held while being ridiculed in a room that was supposed to stand for impartiality and truth. And still, she remained composed. But why? Why stay quiet when the entire world expected her to fight back? Was she playing politics? Strategizing behind closed doors? Or was something deeper at work? The answer came quietly at first, in the form of a sealed ethics complaint filed with the Judicial Conduct Board. The name on the document was Jasmine Crockett. What few knew was that this wasn't Crockett's first run-in with Hallstrom. Years before, when she was still a civil rights attorney fighting for wrongly incarcerated clients, she had crossed paths with him in another courtroom. He had dismissed her filings with disdain then too, called them theatrical distractions. She had buried that memory, moved on, evolved into a legislator, a national voice. But some wounds don't stay closed. Some men don't change. This time, she had power. And this time, she had evidence. What began as a single complaint snowballed. Whispers turned into testimonies. Former clerks spoke up. Defense attorneys began recounting similar moments, some on the record, others afraid but willing to share, under anonymity. Patterns emerged of intimidation, bias, even threats made behind chambers' closed doors. The Department of Justice sent a quiet inquiry to the courthouse. Routine, they called it. But the tension among Hallstrom's staff turned brittle. Suddenly his chambers were less bustling and more like a bunker. Doors that had always remained open were now locked. Conversation stopped when anyone unfamiliar walked down the hallway. And then came the subpoena, emails, internal memos, even sealed audio recordings from in-camera proceedings, long believed lost or protected, began surfacing. There was one in particular, a recording between Hallstrom and a prosecutor discussing how to corner her. It was vague enough to require interpretation, but chilling enough to demand accountability. Still, Hallstrom refused to step down. At a hastily arranged press conference, he blamed an orchestrated campaign by political opportunists to discredit his work. His voice was firm, his face was pale. But Crockett hadn't said a word publicly yet, and that scared him more than anything else. Behind the scenes, she was building something more powerful than outrage. She was building a case. Names were being cataloged. Testimonies were being verified. And the network of legal professionals he had once cowed into silence was beginning to stir. Crockett visited the U.S. Attorney's Office under no obligation. She carried a folder tucked beneath her arm, nothing digital. She met behind glass, no leaks, no distractions. And when she emerged from that building, she smiled for the first time since the mockery in courtroom 12. It wasn't for the cameras. It wasn't a performance. It was the smile of someone who knew the storm was coming, and that this time she was the one holding the thunder. The first real fracture came not from the Department of Justice, but from within Hallstrom's own house. A young judicial clerk named Elena Voss, only a year into her position, filed her resignation in the dead of night. The letter was short, clinical, but the attached affidavit was anything but. In it, she detailed what many had long suspected: that Judge Hallstrom fostered an environment ruled not by law, but fear, that rulings were shaped less by precedent and more by personal vendettas, and that he had a file, a physical leather-bound ledger, where he kept handwritten notes about attorneys and public figures he disliked. Jasmine Crockett's name was underlined in red. The press obtained excerpts within hours. Suddenly, courtroom 12 was no longer a theater of justice. It was a crime scene. What happens when the one meant to uphold justice becomes the villain? When the robe itself is stained, do we still honor the gavel? People began to speak. Not just lawyers and aides, but defendants, many long since convicted, who claimed they'd faced bias under Hallstrom's rule. Some were dismissed as opportunists, but others brought documentation. One man had appealed 3 times and lost under Hallstrom each time, despite irrefutable evidence that another judge later overturned in minutes. And now he wanted his name cleared. The walls were closing in. Hallstrom appeared again before the cameras, but this time there was no indignation in his voice, only calculation. He leaned heavily on legal jargon, tried to reframe the narrative as a political ambush. But people weren't buying it. And then Crockett spoke. She didn't take a podium. She didn't schedule a press conference. Instead, she walked into a Sunday town hall in the heart of her district, stood in front of 200 folding chairs filled with citizens, many of whom had followed her rise since she was a local attorney, and told the story herself. She described the courtroom, the laughter, the humiliation. But more importantly, she painted a picture of how corruption hides, not behind dark alleys and cash envelopes, but in smiles, in titles, in Judges Who Confuse Their Seat with Their Self-Worth. She didn't cry, but her voice broke just once when she recalled a mother who had come to her office years earlier, asking how her son could be sentenced so harshly for a non-violent charge. She never knew until now that Hallstrom had been the presiding judge. By the time she finished speaking, the room was silent. Then one woman stood, then another. Applause rose not out of celebration, but solidarity. And far beyond that town hall, millions watched the live stream, shared the video, commented with their own stories. This wasn't about one judge anymore. It was about a system, and the reckoning it could no longer avoid. The Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court issued a rare public statement 2 days later, acknowledging the gravity of recent disclosures and urging full cooperation with the investigation. That same morning, 2 federal agents arrived at the courthouse. They weren't there to chat. Hallstrom refused to answer questions. He ordered his staff to deny access to files, but it was too late for arrogance. A sealed indictment had been signed the night before, and as Judge Richard Hallstrom walked into courtroom 12 that morning, prepared to carry out a pretrial motion in another case, he was met not with respect, but with silence. Then footsteps. Then a voice. "Judge Hallstrom," the lead marshal said, steady and calm. "You need to come with us." He didn't resist. But as he rose from his seat, you could see it. Not fear, not shame. Confusion. How had it come to this? How had he become the one standing trial? The court recessed without gavel or ceremony, and the halls that once echoed with his authority now whispered something new. Justice, long delayed, had started moving. The media called it the fall of the robe. A poetic label, maybe, but the reality was far messier. Judge Richard Hallstrom had been indicted on multiple counts: obstruction of justice, conspiracy to retaliate against federal witnesses, and violations of judicial ethics so severe they triggered a parallel disciplinary panel before his trial even began. For the first time in his career, he stood not behind the bench, but before it. He didn't wear the robe anymore, just a suit, stripped of its former elegance by the cuffs at his wrists and the manila folders stacked high on the prosecution's table. The courtroom was standing room only when the hearing began. Journalists jostled with law students and retired judges. But it wasn't the press that made the air heavy. It was the presence of those who had been wronged: victims, defendants, attorneys, even former jurors who had long harbored doubts about the fairness of their proceedings. And there, in the front row, sat Jasmine Crockett. She didn't wear political armor that day. No podium, no entourage. Just a charcoal suit, a notebook in her lap, and eyes that never left the man she once stood before. The prosecution laid out its case with surgical precision. Emails that revealed a pattern of retaliation against attorneys who questioned his rulings. Private messages that mocked defendants. Recordings that captured phone calls between Hallstrom and prosecutors. Planning strategies to undermine certain witnesses. One of those witnesses was Crockett. Then came the testimonies. A former public defender, tears in her voice, recounted how Hallstrom would throw her motions into his trash bin, literally, before ruling against them. A clerk told of doctored calendar entries designed to prevent certain attorneys from appearing at hearings in time. And one man, exonerated after serving 4 years, showed a copy of his handwritten appeal that Hallstrom had marked redundant nonsense before denying it without hearing. And still, Hallstrom said nothing. But Jasmine Crockett did. Her testimony came on the 3rd day. She stepped onto the stand with calm resolve, and when she spoke, the courtroom leaned in. She didn't just recount what had happened in courtroom 12. She described what it meant, what it felt like to be mocked, not as a politician, not even as a woman, but as a citizen who had once believed that courtrooms were sacred. She spoke not in rage, but with purpose, each word deliberate, each sentence like a chisel against stone. "I was not silenced that day," she said, voice steady. "I was studied, dissected, and dismissed, because that is what power does when it fears losing control. It mocks, it ridicules, and it hopes you will collapse under the weight of humiliation." She looked straight at Hallstrom. "But I didn't, and I won't." There was no applause. The judge presiding over the case had warned the court against outbursts, but the silence after her testimony carried more weight than cheers ever could. That night, the footage of her testimony went viral, not because it was flashy. It wasn't, but because it was truth. And in an age of performance, truth still had gravity. Hallstrom's defense unraveled quickly after that. He took the stand only once, delivering a tone-deaf monologue about stress, political pressure, and misinterpretations. His attorneys looked exhausted. The jurors looked unmoved. By the end of the week, the state's judicial panel recommended permanent disbarment, a first in the region's history for a sitting judge. Outside the courthouse, protesters began gathering, not in chaos, but in solidarity. Some held photos of family members they believed had been sentenced unfairly by Hallstrom. Others simply carried signs that read, "Dignity has a voice." And Jasmine? She stood at the back of the crowd, away from the cameras, watching a new generation find its fire. Because justice wasn't just about one arrest, one trial, or one disgrace. It was about what came next. The city courthouse, once a symbol of permanence, felt fragile on the day the verdict was read. The sky hung low with clouds, the kind that press on your shoulders like weight. Inside, the air was tight with breath and silence. Cameras rolled, quietly behind velvet ropes. Reporters didn't shout. Even the murmurs had dimmed. It had been 11 days of testimony, documentation, and public scrutiny. 11 days that cracked open not only the conduct of one judge, but the hidden architecture of a legal system that allowed such conduct to fester unchecked. When the jury returned, they did so without meeting anyone's eyes. Their faces were pale, their steps rehearsed. Every movement was heavy with consequence. The judge asked for the verdict. On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty. A ripple, like the tremor before a wave, passed through the courtroom. On the charge of conspiracy to retaliate against a federal witness, guilty. No one moved. No one breathed. And on the charge of violating judicial ethics with malicious intent, guilty. 3 words echoed through the chamber. Guilty. 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 For the first time in decades, Richard Hallstrom's posture cracked. He didn't weep. He didn't speak. But his hands trembled, barely. And for a man who once scoffed at fear, that tremble meant everything. The presiding judge ordered him remanded to federal custody until sentencing. No bail. No delay. As the marshals approached, Hallstrom turned, just briefly, toward the gallery. His eyes met Jasmine Crockett's for a split second, and she did not look away. No smirk, no satisfaction. Just quiet resolve. Because this wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. Outside, the crowd had grown. They weren't chanting. They were waiting. Not for punishment, but for acknowledgement that justice, though slow, had arrived. Crockett stepped out of the courthouse into the swirl of flashing bulbs and reaching microphones. For the first time since the trial began, she addressed the public. "I did not come here to destroy a man," she said, voice low and clear. "I came here to remind this system of what it was built to protect. The people, all of them. Not just the powerful, not just the favored, but everyone who walks into a courtroom and dares to believe in fairness." She paused. Cameras clicked, but her eyes never left the faces in the crowd. The tired mothers, the former defendants, the young students holding signs. This wasn't justice falling from the sky. This was justice being fought for, inch by inch. And we are not done. The crowd didn't roar. They stood in reverent silence, then, slowly, began to clap, not for spectacle, but in recognition of the fight, of the truth, of the weight lifted, even just a little. In the months that followed, the aftermath unfolded. Hallstrom was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, with stripped pension and public censure. Multiple past convictions from his bench were reopened for review. The state judiciary launched a sweeping investigation into courtroom practices and launched a new oversight committee, one with teeth this time. But more than policies and reforms, something deeper shifted. People began to believe, if only slightly, more than before, that power could be held accountable. And Crockett? She returned to the Capitol. The mockery she once endured now lived only in news archives and memory, but it had given her something few politicians ever earn. Not just respect, but proof of integrity in action. Years from now, few would remember the name of the courthouse or the date of the verdict, but they would remember the image. A woman, once mocked into silence, standing firm while the man who tried to diminish her was led away in handcuffs. Not because she shouted louder, but because she refused to be small.